Welcome to the Longevity Show. I'm Dr. Hilary Lynn, Stanford-trained MD, practicing longevity physician. And today we're diving into one of the most important aspects of our existence, mental health. Mental health is what governs our experience of life, our emotions, and ultimately our fulfillment. While artificial intelligence might one day replicate almost every other aspect of human capability, what it can never truly grasp is the subjective experience, the feelings, the emotions that drive every poem, every masterpiece, from classics like Pride and Prejudice to the magical world of Harry Potter. And all of this beautiful complexity, it's all rooted in biology. So today we'll explore how that biology shapes our every experience. I want to share a bit of my own story. Growing up, I experienced extreme highs and lows, moments of deep anxiety, times when depression seemed to overshadow everything else. I was such a motivated person. I went to medical school. I went through all that training. I made the decision to become an entrepreneur. These were hard decisions that left me with a lot of emotional challenges through times. And throughout this process, therapy was a key part of my journey. It helped me understand and work through the challenging feelings. But I actually think the real turning point for me, the moment when I started to genuinely feel better consistently, actually came when I began to focus on my health and well-being. When I was growing up, I barely slept. I would sleep 4 hours a night sometimes, trying to cram in all those extra hours working hard. When I finally focused on getting enough sleep, getting proper nutrition, and very recently, I'm embarrassed to admit, focusing on my physical exercise habits, that really turned out to be critical for my mental health. But today isn't just about what we've heard before about lifestyle changes. We're going way deeper. We're going to examine the biochemical reasons for our moods and emotions, and we're going to explore the strategies we can employ as a result. There was so much to put in this episode that I decided to divide it up into two parts. So today's main focus will be on neurotransmitters and hormones. I'll save the rest for later, but sneak peek, it's going to be about mitochondria. So by the end of this episode, you'll have a clearer picture of how to support your mental well-being from the inside out. Before diving into biology, it's important to first understand what mood really is. So mood is often defined as a pervasive and sustained feeling one experiences internally, and which influences nearly every aspect of our behavior and perception of the world. Unlike emotions, which tend to be more fleeting and triggered by specific events, moods are longer lasting and shape how we approach life as a whole. You can imagine them as the color of our experience. They color our interactions, our motivation, and even our physical well-being. It's like that background music playing throughout our day. When the music is upbeat and energetic, it makes even mundane tasks feel lighter and more enjoyable. But when that background music is dark and heavy, it can make even the simplest of actions feel really daunting. That sustained quality is what makes mood so powerful. It's that lens through which we see the world. Mood disorders occur when this background music becomes stuck in a way that doesn't serve us. Either too low, like a constant depressive undertone, or too high, as in periods of mania. These disorders, including major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, cyclothymia, and many others, are common psychiatric conditions that can severely impact our quality of life. They're not just emotional states, to be clear. They are disruptions that involve complex biological, psychological, and social factors. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, which is commonly called the DSM-5, categorizes mood disorders into two main types: bipolar disorders and depressive disorders. So bipolar disorders involve periods of elevated mood, mania, or a little bit lower than mania is what we call hypomania, and periods of depression. While depressive disorders, such as major depressive disorder, involve feelings of sadness and loss of interest in doing everyday things. So these conditions are incredibly debilitating, not just for the person experiencing them, but also for their loved ones. And they come with increased risks of morbidity or illness, and even mortality in some cases. So what causes these profound shifts in our mood? The answer is really complicated. It's multifaceted. Biological factors play a significant role. Imbalances in neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine can lead to the mood disruptions. Structural differences in the brain, such as changes in the size or function of the amygdala and orbital frontal cortex, have also been linked to mood disorders. So, for example, research has shown that patients with mood disorders often have an enlarged amygdala, a part of the brain associated with processing emotions. So, this suggests and supports that abnormalities in these certain brain areas can contribute to persistent emotional challenges seen in mood disorders. And it kind of explains why certain things seem to be more present in certain people and not others. We all have anatomical differences. Some of this is congenital, we're born with them. Some of them are genetic, they're encoded in our DNA. There are some psychosocial factors, of course, that influence our mood too. So stressful life events, trauma, and especially early childhood adversity are all risk factors for developing mood disorders. For example, experiences like the death of a loved one, childhood abuse, or significant changes in life circumstances can act as catalysts. They trigger mood disorders in individuals who might already have a biological predisposition. Genetics, like I mentioned, play a really key role. Twin studies show that mood disorders are very heritable. So if somebody in your family has experienced a mood disorder, you are at a higher risk of developing one yourself. Sometimes in my practice, I'll even ask if people know of relatives who have taken a certain antidepressant, and that can help guide me in choosing one. And this doesn't work every time, but sometimes that helps me find one that works a little bit better upfront. The genetic link certainly doesn't guarantee you'll develop a mood disorder. For example, in my own family, I've got many people who are just, it seems, very anxious at heart, and it seems like a core part of their existence. But then I've got other folks, other relatives who are just cheerful and happy all the time. So we all get this melting pot of genetic reasons to be one way or another, and the events in our lives and how we intervene in our own emotions does impact our eventual mood. So it's really important to understand what mood is and what happens when it becomes dysregulated. And that is the foundation for everything else we'll be discussing. As a quick note, while mood provides that enduring backdrop of our internal experiences, emotions are the vivid brushstrokes that bring immediate color to our lives. It's that fleeting experience of joy or anger, whatever it might be, even complex emotions like jealousy or regret. Unlike moods, which are longer lasting and less specific, emotions are very short lived. They arise in response to particular stimuli or situations. You can think of mood as the weather pattern of the mind. So, what you might expect in Southeast Asia at any given month, that is mood. But emotions are the sudden bursts of sunshine or a downpour of rain, moment to moment. Emotions are multifaceted as well, and it does involve so much from our mind, like how we're thinking, and also our body, of course, the physiological reasons for why we feel certain ways. In fact, you can almost retranslate certain things. I actually had a really interesting conversation with one of my patients recently. And he's somebody who was dealing with really devastating insomnia. So we decided to try medication. But some of the medication actually caused too much sedation early into the morning. And he described it not that he was feeling sleepy in the morning. He wasn't just falling back asleep. He actually said that he would just sit on the couch and feel depressed. And that's something that I've heard before from other people who are overly sedated. So you might not feel that you're sleepy. Your body might interpret it as something different, like a low mood or a lack of motivation, even what you might call depression. Our bodies are really interesting. Our brains interpret things very differently. If, for example, you have caffeine or a stimulant, or in the extreme case, don't recommend it, but if you have cocaine, that's why these stimulants often level up a person's mood. People go from feeling kind of down to being like, wow, I'm excited. That's why emotions are kind of complicated, because things that affect our heart rate or how fast we're breathing, or even like how our pupils are dilating, that influences how we think, decide, and interact and feel. This is so complicated, but I want to just emphasize over and again that emotions, like mood, are very much biological in their core. We're not at fault. And oftentimes it's very hard to control our emotions unless you're a really, really practiced monk or somebody who has deep control over their emotions and can actually even alter their heartbeat. So there are some people who are that in tune with their physiological processes. You can impact the rate of your heart heartbeat and the rate of your breathing to a point where you can actually impact your emotions. Early theories, such as those by even Charles Darwin, suggested that emotions were evolved to communicate our internal states to others. So smiles convey happiness and frowns displeasure. And this was foundational in understanding emotions as universal experience shared across human cultures. Yet, as our understanding of the mind has evolved, so has our perspective on emotions. Later on in the 20th century, William James argued that our emotions are responses to physiological changes, like I was mentioning. In other words, he suggested we don't run because we are afraid. Instead, we feel fear because we run. So that shaped the foundation for subsequent decades, and a lot of research has been done since then about the connections between the emotion and the body. The most recent theories really suggest that emotions are constructed from the brain's attempt to make sense of all the different signals coming in from the body and external environment. This views emotions as emergent, so built from our past experiences, our current context, and the meaning we attach to those experiences. So emotions aren't fixed. They're really dynamic and flexible, and they can vary depending on so many factors like culture, personal history, even the language we use to describe our feelings. I'm bilingual, somewhat trilingual, and I've always felt that that has helped me understand how people feel differently in different cultures. Because in Mandarin and Taiwanese, which are already a little bit different, you have different words or different ways of describing things compared to in English. For example, time is a little bit different. In English, there's so many ways to describe future tense, past tense, our experience of time. But in Mandarin, you simply state a fact like, I eat lunch, and then you say yesterday or now or tomorrow. And so that timing is almost after the fact. There's this focus on the action at place. So even subtle differences like that for grammar really impact how you feel, your meaning that you interpret from an event. So I find that so interesting. And that's one of the main reasons why, even in an age where AI will probably be able to instantaneously translate for us between different languages, I still think there's so much value in understanding different languages. Perhaps the final thing I'll say about emotions, which I think is really applicable to our everyday experience, is that since emotion is fleeting, you can interpret them in a way to level them out and not let them influence our overall mood. So momentary feelings of anxiety could, for example, contribute to a prolonged anxious mood. But if you intervene in that fact, if you learn how to self-soothe, as I like to say, because actually in babies, it's a really important skill that they learn and when they're young, how to self-soothe. When they're really young, the parents have to come over and soothe the baby, make sure everything's okay. But one of the most important things a child learns is how to calm themselves down when something is distressing them. I think many of us are still learning how to self-soothe, just to greater and greater challenges as we live through life. I bring that back to those momentary feelings of stress, anxiety. If you don't self-soothe properly and you don't resolve that, it can really contribute to this prolonged anxiety. On the other hand, if you have a moment of joy, you can take that and you can really sit with it, reflect on it, intertwine it with your experience to develop this more generally optimistic outlook. By studying emotions as the building blocks of mood, we develop this deeper understanding of how to navigate our emotional world and cultivate emotional resilience and well-being. Now I want to dive into the biochemical details. So bear with me. If this is not familiar with you, I'll try to keep it to really easy to understand concepts while not losing some of the scientific detail that I think is so important. Emotions and moods may seem like purely psychological experiences, but they're so deeply intertwined with the biochemical processes of the body. Understanding the biochemistry provides greater insight, and I'm going to explain too how the different things we do, the different medications we take, even supplements and food and our gut and all these different things, they all play a role in shaping how we feel moment to moment as well as over longer periods. The most foundational biochemical piece to our emotions and mood are neurotransmitters. So these are chemicals, molecules of different types that transmit signals between neurons, your brain cells, and play crucial roles in determining how we feel, think, and behave. Among the many different neurotransmitters out there, there are so many. Some of the most significant for mood are dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, and GABA. So that's capitalized GABA. Each of these neurotransmitters contributes to our emotional landscape, and disruptions in their levels or function can have really profound effects on mood. Various factors, including drugs, lifestyle habits, and stress, can negatively impact these neurotransmitter systems, leading to mood disturbances. Chronic alcohol use, for example, impairs dopamine and GABA signaling and contributes to mood issues and dependency. If you have nutritional deficiencies, such as a lack of omega-3 fatty acids, certain vitamins and minerals, that can also hinder the production of neurotransmitters. So that can worsen mood imbalances. Different lifestyle habits like prolonged stress and poor sleep hygiene also alter your neurotransmitter regulation, leading to increased cortisol levels, reduced serotonin production, and impaired dopamine signaling, all which really significantly impact emotional health. Let's go a little bit more into detail with each of these neurotransmitters. Dopamine is often referred to as the reward neurotransmitter because it has a really important role in driving motivation, pleasure, and reward-seeking behaviors. So when dopamine levels are optimal, we feel motivated, focused, and excited. However, disruptions in dopamine signaling can lead to mood disorders such as depression, as well as conditions like ADHD, or even on the more severe end, schizophrenia is not caused by dopamine, but in schizophrenia, we have a dysregulation of too much dopamine. A really, really interesting thing that we have found is that folks with schizophrenia, we have what we believe to be higher levels of dopamine, and that triggers activities like seeking sexual activity or smoking a lot. So these reward-seeking type behaviors, and you see that across the board with people who have really severe schizophrenia. The treatments we give them will unfortunately sometimes cause side effects that we call Parkinsonism. These are similar to Parkinson's in that people have tremors or movements that are really unusual. They're movement problems. And on the other end, when you have Parkinson's, you have those tremors. And when we give people treatments with dopaminergic drugs, they sometimes develop really fascinating reward-seeking behavior. So some people who are, they call themselves like really boring. They don't do much. They don't go out. And then they start these medications and they have a bad side effect because they start gambling or they start having sexual affairs. And it doesn't make any sense in the context of their life. But that's just an extreme example to illustrate how important it is to have proper dopamine balance and how we don't have perfect solutions for people with more severe diseases. Also, factors in early life like stress can have really lasting impact on one's dopamine regulation, and it predisposes you to issues with mood and motivation later in life. For example, young teenagers or young adults who use addictive substances like cocaine and methamphetamine, they can drastically alter their dopamine neurotransmission. This causes intense short-term pleasure, but leads to long-term imbalances that can result in mood disorders and addiction, of course. Actually, addictive behaviors can have similar problematic effects as well. So gambling, excessive social media scrolling, or binge watching content can actually disrupt dopamine regulation as well. It reinforces dependency and negatively affects mood stability. Sometimes when people describe like a dopamine fast, I'm like, what does that even mean? But I get it. It's trying to stay away from the things that trigger that reward system in you. And I've done this so much in my own past, almost to the extreme. For example, when I was a kid, it was like almost overnight. I learned that sugar like Coke and candy were bad for you. And I cut myself off of candy almost overnight, like before I turned 10 years old, I think. So it was really funny. And I was probably a little bit of a neurotic child, but you can cut yourself off and your brain will actually rewire and adapt. If you stop binging Netflix, you will get used to it after a period of 1 or 2 weeks. That's actually a good reminder for myself. I currently am on a bit of a more TV watching than I'd like. And Sometimes you just need to take a pause, and it's painful. You can feel bored. It can be very uncomfortable for the first couple of weeks. But like with sugar, which I've talked about endlessly, you can cut that reward cycle in half. That can be really healthy for you. But I do want to mention that you don't want to deprive yourself of all rewarding things. Obviously, we want to have joy in our lives. We want to enjoy our life doing healthy things. So choose what you want to enjoy. Maybe it's reading, maybe it's spending time with your kids, or whatever it might be, and focus your attention on that. And eventually you actually can adapt your brain towards loving those types of things because your reward wiring will change. So I mentioned the extreme side effects of schizophrenia and Parkinson's drugs, but there are lots of other medications that many people are familiar with that affect our dopamine transporters. For example, amphetamines and methylphenidate are commonly used for ADHD, and they definitely affect our dopamine transporters. So that can impact how a person behaves even long term. There's also bupropion, also known as Wellbutrin, the brand name, which I use all the time for mood disorders. It's so helpful for anxiety and depression. But, nothing is perfect. They do also target some of these pathways with dopamine, and this can affect your mood stability over time. Work with your doctor. If you need these medications, absolutely, you should take them. But always look to drug holidays if possible, if that makes sense for you. So often in my ADHD patients who need to take stimulants, otherwise they can't function well in their work life or in their personal life either, I tell them, yes, you can take these stimulants. They're very helpful in that case. But you might want to take a drug holiday on weekends. And perhaps most relatable, our everyday activities and lifestyle can also really impact our dopamine balance. Like I mentioned, of course, you can cut those reward cycles in half if you have like a really bad habit, like snacking at night or playing too many video games. But of course, chronic stress and really poor sleep can elevate your glucocorticoid levels, so the stress hormone levels, and that impairs our dopamine synthesis and release. So that can contribute further to feelings of fatigue and low motivation. Poor diet, especially ones high in processed foods and sugars, of course, can also increase your oxidative stress and inflammation, and that negatively impacts dopamine metabolism. A really interesting topic I want to bring up in the context of dopamine is the dysregulation of the endocannabinoid system. This sounds familiar, right? Because cannabinoid, cannabis, right? We think about this all the time. Chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, and lifestyle factors such as the poor diet and lack of exercise, like we've mentioned, can impair the endocannabinoid system and its signaling. It plays a very important role in modulating dopamine release. So disruptions in this system can lead to altered dopamine signaling, even long term. Heavy cannabis use, especially during adolescence when our brains are forming, can really dysregulate the ECS and by extension, dopamine balance, even for the long term. So that's why we are so careful in the teenage years to tell parents, like, be careful, Alcohol was really, really bad, and I'm really glad that young people are drinking less and less, but cannabis isn't fantastic for you either, especially while your brain is so malleable. It really impacts your risk for things like mood disturbances and other psychiatric disorders. It can unveil schizophrenia and folks who are predisposed to it. So that's something to be aware of. For people who are frequent marijuana users too, they lack dreams, not just the dreams at night, but you actually start dreaming less in terms of ambition. That's because your endocannabinoid system is so tied to dopamine, which governs your motivation. So that's how it's all tied together. And that's why one should be really careful, even in our downtime, what we're putting in our bodies. Let's talk about norepinephrine. Norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline, is integral to the body's fight or flight response. So that influences our alertness, our focus, and our energy. This neurotransmitter is involved in how we respond to stress, and its levels can greatly influence mood. Low levels of norepinephrine are associated with fatigue, low energy, and even symptoms of depression, while elevated levels can contribute to anxiety and agitation. So neither is great. I know we talk all the time about how we want to lower our stress, our adrenaline levels to calm down, but we need it every so often, of course, like to get up and go. We needed to wake up in the morning and get going with our day. We needed to start running on the treadmill. We needed to, be alert even. So it's really important to have the proper balance and flexibility. Chronic stress can lead to excessive release of norepinephrine, and that keeps the body in a prolonged state of what we call hyperarousal. This not only affects emotional health, but also impairs cognitive functions, such as decision making and emotional regulation, because it disrupts our prefrontal cortical function. Prefrontal just means that front part of our brain. We often refer to it as the part that governs our executive function or helps us make important decisions. And it also helps us do all the things that make us human. So prolonged stress-induced norepinephrine release has been linked to the development of so many different mental health conditions, most importantly, PTSD and ADHD, because it negatively impacts that prefrontal cortex. Inflammation can also influence norepinephrine balance because elevated plasma norepinephrine levels tend to have pro-inflammatory effects. So you can imagine if you are stressed out, you have an enemy in front of you, you're going to stress out your body, and stress tells your body, all right, we need to get inflamed. We might have to tackle an infection, for example. That's why you get this pro-inflammatory effect. Neuronal, so in your brain or in your nervous system, norepinephrine actually, interestingly, has anti-inflammatory properties. Also, neurodegenerative diseases such as Parkinson's disease and multiple system atrophy can lead to cardiovascular sympathetic denervation. That results in norepinephrine deficiency and symptoms like neurogenic orthostatic hypotension. So this is a condition where the blood pressure drops upon standing because you have insufficient norepinephrine. It can be so extreme that we call the syndrome POTS. So if you've ever heard of this, POTS, it's been going around on social media, so I thought I'd mention it. This is a condition where you don't have enough of that norepinephrine. We can also have epigenetic changes. So remember, epigenetic means changes on top of the genes, such as modifications in the norepinephrine transporter gene. And that can impair the reuptake or the how much norepinephrine we bring back, and contributes to POTS, which leads to that abnormal increase in heart rate while standing up, sometimes feeling faint, that orthostatic hypotension. Medications like tricyclic antidepressants and SNRIs, which are serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, aim to balance norepinephrine levels and stabilize mood and improve energy. But they can also lead to increased plasma norepinephrine levels, potentially causing false positives for conditions like pheochromocytoma. So that's a rare tumor that can cause high blood pressure. This is also why certain drugs can make certain people anxious. So I brought up Wellbutrin, bupropion before. Usually it can help with calming and making people less anxious, but it's currently still inexplicable why. In other people, it makes people more anxious. And it probably has to do with that norepinephrine activity, but we just don't understand why some people react one way and other people react the complete opposite way. So the final important neurotransmitter I want to discuss is GABA. Gamma aminobutyric acid. This is the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, like a brake in a car. So this is responsible for calming neuronal activity and reducing anxiety. It works by decreasing the excitability of the neurons, putting a brake on excessive activity in different parts of the brain. And this helps maintain a balance by counteracting the excitatory effects of neurotransmitters like norepinephrine and dopamine. When GABA levels are adequate, people feel relaxed, less prone to anxiety, and more able to manage stress effectively. When we get disruptions in GABA signaling, we unfortunately get mood disorders, neurodevelopmental disorders, everything from anxiety, depression, to autism spectrum disorder, and even epilepsy. There's factors such as genetic variations in GABA receptor genes, neurodevelopmental issues, and neuroinflammation, which can all impair GABAergic signaling. For example, early life stress, such as being separated from your mom, can really delay the normal development of GABAergic inhibition. This leads to increased susceptibility or tendency to mood and behavioral disorders later in life. So that's why it's so important early on. And we're going to talk about hormones too, because this interweaves with hormonal health. This is why it's so important for babies to have that close contact with their moms, even skin to skin contact, as is proven. Neuroinflammation is often often triggered by chronic stress or some rare conditions like hyperammonemia, can also impair GABA function and leading to those emotional problems and cognitive difficulties. Mood regulation is rarely about a single transmitter acting in isolation. Instead, it's this result of a complex interplay between different neurotransmitter systems. For example, dopamine and serotonin have this reciprocal relationship where imbalances in one can affect the other. Serotonin helps regulate dopamine, which in turn influences motivation and reward. So this dance, this intricate balance means that disruption in one neurotransmitter can cascade into broader mood dysregulation. That's why it's so important to be really careful when we take medications that impact our neurotransmitters, because medications are blunt tools. They're really, really powerful, but they can impact and leak into other areas of our mood as a result of their powerful impact. GABA and norepinephrine also have this interplay that maintains emotional stability. So GABA's inhibitory effects are crucial for balancing the arousal driven by norepinephrine. And when this balance is disrupted, people might have heightened anxiety or agitation or feel overly down. These interactions are so important to understand to develop strategies for managing mood disorders. You might be wondering, what might we do about this? I want to talk about the factors that might negatively impact our neurotransmitter balance so that you can be aware of them. Drugs and alcohol, of course. Alcohol, cocaine, prescription medications even can alter our neurotransmitter levels. As we spoke about, the chronic alcohol use impairs dopamine and GABA signaling and contributes to mood disturbances and also creates a dependency. Stimulants like cocaine or ADHD medications can increase dopamine temporarily, but lead to long-term deficiencies that impair mood and motivation, almost like this withdrawal effect. Diet and nutritional deficiencies also are playing a crucial role in our neurotransmitter disorders. So, for example, serotonin is synthesized from tryptophan, and this is an amino acid found in meats, and like turkey, for example, but many others as well. It's not just turkey, nuts and seeds. And diets lacking essential nutrients like omega-3 fatty acids, vitamins B6 and B12, and minerals like zinc and magnesium can impair neurotransmitter production and lead to mood imbalances. Prolonged stress can also increase cortisol levels, of course. So this can impair the synthesis and function of all different types of things, including serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. And this can eventually lead to symptoms of anxiety, depression, and fatigue. And my favorite to focus on because it's so important. Sleep deprivation. Poor sleep disrupts the regulation of all neurotransmitters. And we can feel that the very next day. Sleep deprivation decreases serotonin and dopamine levels. So people will feel irritable, fatigued, and have lower emotional resilience or this brittleness of one's emotions. And proper sleep is so crucial for replenishing neurotransmitters and overall mood stability. It's that healing, that rest that our brain needs every single day. So neurotransmitters are fundamental to how we experience emotions and regulate our mood. There's such a delicate balance between all of the neurotransmitters, and disruptions due to lifestyle or medications and drugs can really impact our experience of life. Now let's talk about hormones, the emotional regulators. Hormones are vital chemical messengers. They travel through the bloodstream, impacting many aspects of human physiology, including our moods and emotions. They're different from neurotransmitters because neurotransmitters act quickly to transmit signals between nerve cells, and they're acting in a very, very small space. Hormones have a much longer lasting and much more widespread effect. They're traveling all the way from the head down throughout our body, and they last for a longer amount of time. They regulate our complex functions like stress response, social bonding, and mood stabilization. So this interplay makes hormones central to understanding our emotional experience. Neurotransmitters like serotonin get the spotlight in our discussions about mood, but it also functions as a hormone, particularly outside the brain. So we're going to explore the key hormones, including serotonin, but also oxytocin, cortisol, and the gonadal hormones. So estradiol, progesterone, and testosterone. And then we're also going to talk about how they interplay to result in our emotional regulation. Serotonin, the hormone and neurotransmitter. So serotonin is also known as 5-hydroxytryptamine, or 5-HT. It plays a dual role as a neurotransmitter and hormone, with 95% of it actually being produced in the gut. In its role as a neurotransmitter, serotonin operates primarily in the central nervous system, so related to the brain, where it stabilizes our mood, induces feelings of well-being, and regulates anxiety. But as a hormone, it's produced by the enterochromaffin cells in the GI tract, so it helps regulate our bowel movements, gut motility, and immune function. Though serotonin in the gut does not cross the blood-brain barrier, it impacts the brain indirectly by modulating the gut-brain axis, affecting mood through connections like the vagus nerve, which is traveling up through the body. The distinction between the two roles is largely in its location and mechanism. The neurotransmitter, again, acts with nearby nerve cells, rapid signaling, but hormone, it enters the bloodstream and exerts this broader effect. And dysregulation in either role leads to issues like depression, anxiety, and mood swings. So low serotonin levels in the CNS, the central nervous system, directly linked to depression, which is why many antidepressants focus on increasing serotonin availability in the brain. However, if you take SSRIs, you might notice that it has really interesting effects on your stomach. Some people feel nausea, some people have diarrhea, some people feel full, some people want to eat more. All of these things are because serotonin is so impactful in the gut as well as many other places in the body, like sexual health. Oxytocin, the love hormone, is our next focus. So oxytocin is known as a love hormone or the bonding hormone because of its central role in social connection and emotional bonding. Oxytocin is released by the hypothalamus and secreted by the pituitary gland, and their levels rise during activities when hugging, during childbirth, and in breastfeeding, and even during positive social interactions. I don't know about you, but I can feel my oxytocin levels rise immediately with hugs with my partner. It's actually one of my most predictable, happy emotions that I can feel right away. It's so interesting. And I think other people get this from looking at cute pictures of like puppies and cats and things like that. And I get that a little bit too. I love turtles. Don't ask me why. Well, maybe it's because I had a pet turtle growing up, but it's a very strange one to most people. But also hugging, of course. We all get that good feeling. And even when you're hanging out with someone you love, you get that good feeling from oxytocin. So it's predicted that we evolved this feeling with oxytocin to enhance feelings of trust, empathy, and attachment, and plays such a major role in relationships, whether they're romantic, familial, or even in friendships. Interestingly, oxytocin's influence on emotions extends way beyond just the warm and fuzzy feelings. It interacts with the serotonin system to modulate emotional responses. It helps people feel more connected and emotionally regulated. Dysregulation of oxytocin can have profound effects, contributing to mood and social disorders, such as autism spectrum disorder, social anxiety, and borderline personality disorder, or emotional instability. Factors like early life stress, genetic mutations in the oxytocin receptor gene, which is OXTR, and chronic stress through life are known to contribute to oxytocin imbalance. For example, individuals who experience adverse childhood experiences are found to have lower oxytocin levels, and that can negatively impair their ability to form stable social bonds later in life. Finally, let's talk about cortisol, which is known as the stress hormone. This is called the stress hormone because of its key role in the body's response, obviously, to stress. So it's produced by the adrenal glands as part of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, and it prepares our body for fight or flight. So when we're escaping from an enemy like a lion to a gazelle, it increases our glucose availability by pumping it right into the blood. It enhances our brain function and it reduces non-essential bodily functions during periods of acute stress. So that's why it's really actually hard to digest when you've got high cortisol levels. And that's why some people who are really stressed out, they're like, oh my gosh, I'm just so constipated all the time, where I've got heartburn or regurg. That's because your body is in fight or flight and it doesn't digest properly. It's also obviously really hard to rest and sleep because, everything is turned up. However, I want to emphasize that short bursts of cortisol are adaptive or helpful because it helps us respond effectively to immediate challenges. It's the chronically elevated cortisol levels that have detrimental effects on mood mood and emotional health. So this chronic elevation of cortisol leads to structural and functional changes in the brain, actually. It particularly affects areas such as the hippocampus, which is involved in memory, and the prefrontal cortex, again, that's involved with decision-making and emotional regulation. Prolonged exposure to cortisol over time can impair these parts of the brain and leads to things like anxiety, depression, and trouble thinking, cognitive difficulties. Dysregulation of the HPA axis is commonly observed actually in mood disorders because the body's stress response becomes either too active, hyperactive, or blunted, which is too low. And that can severely impact our emotional well-being. So last but not least, gonadal hormones, estradiol, progesterone, and testosterone play such important roles in our mood regulation, influencing how emotions are processed and experienced. These hormones fluctuate throughout the menstrual cycle in females and in response to various stimuli in males, leading to the differences that we see in emotional responses. So this is not trying to say certain things about males versus females because people get all up in arms about it. This is just to explain the common patterns. Stereotypes come from truths, and these patterns occur because of sexual hormone differences between males and females. This doesn't mean that we can't regulate them. Obviously, we want to understand the biology, but it doesn't mean that we don't have power over the biology. So estradiol is the main form of estrogen in most of our bodies, has a significant effect on mood and emotional regulation, particularly in females, but also in males. During phases of the menstrual cycle when estradiol is high, such as the follicular phase, so that's the phase right after your period starts, the follicular phase, the first for follicular, and L for later or luteal phase. That's how I remember the different parts of the cycle. In that follicular phase with higher estradiol, women often feel improved mood and enhanced emotional resilience. So you feel emotionally stronger. Estradiol also affects the different parts of our brain, like the prefrontal cortex, to enhance our cognitive function and emotional regulation. Low estradiol levels during perimenopause or postpartum periods are linked to increased vulnerability to depression and anxiety. Progesterone fluctuates throughout the menstrual cycle and can have different effects on the mood depending on its levels and interactions with estradiol. Of course, it's not simple. So high levels of progesterone during the luteal phase, so that's the latter phase after ovulation, particularly when it's converted to the neuroactive metabolite, allopregnanolone, are associated with increased emotional reactivity and symptoms of irritability and anxiety. These effects are well documented in conditions like PMS or premenstrual syndrome and premenstrual dysphoric disorder, PMDD, which is a much more severe version of the emotional distress. That's when sensitivity to hormone changes really impacts mood regulation. People feel more fragile and more depressed sometimes, or more anxious, more irritable. Now let's talk about testosterone. Testosterone is typically associated with males, of course, but it is present in both sexes and very important. It plays a role in modulating aggression, motivation, and social behavior. And higher testosterone levels are linked to assertiveness and dominance, but also with irritability and aggression in certain circumstances. Testosterone interacts with the amygdala, remember that key part of the brain for emotional processing, influencing the intensity of emotional responses. It's a fun fact, but amongst longevity physicians who practice with testosterone replacement for women as well as men, they see that women actually are very happy and pleased with almost super therapeutic testosterone levels. I'm not promoting this practice. I think that you have to be aware of the risks. When you have too high levels of testosterone, it can lead to trouble with your heart health, for example. But it's just really interesting because it definitely gives you a certain flavor of your emotions. And some people really like that. Higher testosterone levels in women, for example, and probably in men, lead to more risk-taking behavior and this strive or ambition or leadership. And again, people are going to make all these conclusions about what that means in society, but that's not my intent. My intent is really just to explain that our hormones are so much more in charge of our personality, our values, and our actions than we probably give them credit for. So understanding how hormones can become dysregulated dysregulated is really key to understanding their impact on our emotional health. Gonadal hormone imbalances can occur due to everything from genetics to stress and obesity, or transitions like puberty, pregnancy, or menopause. The menstrual cycle itself, of course, leads to these fluctuations of emotions. And again, the luteal phase, progesterone is high, can lead to that emotional reactivity. And then, of course, I want to emphasize that during menopause, that gradual decline of estradiol and progesterone can lead to all kinds of mood symptoms like anxiety, depression, and mood instability. Hormone therapy, particularly transdermal estradiol combined with intermittent micronized progesterone for people who need that, has been shown to stabilize mood and prevent depressive symptoms during that transition. So in addition to hormone therapy, there's also other types of interventions that can help balance our hormones. Remember how chronic stress impacts our HPA axis, leading to that prolonged cortisol release. So techniques such as CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness practices, and most importantly, I think, physical exercise regularly are really effective in reducing stress and therefore lowering chronic cortisol levels. Again, diet and nutrition are so incredibly important. Once had a patient who was doing a lot of, healthy exercise, but also doing some prolonged fasting every so often. And that actually led to pretty low levels of hormone levels. Most particularly, we noticed in testosterone, because it's hard to interpret estrogen and progesterone levels in a woman since it cycles so often and changes through life. But for testosterone, we just saw like almost no free testosterone. And I determined that it was because she had been fasting so much that she was lacking some of the nutrition, such as essential fatty acids, omega-3s, that help with producing more hormones. Vitamin D too, like all of these nutrients that we talk about often, vitamin D, B6, B12, minerals like magnesium and zinc, that can help us produce more and regulate our hormones. Understanding the impact of our hormones really allows us to appreciate the biochemical foundations of emotions and provides us with ways for intervening on our emotional health and resilience. So by managing our stress, making dietary adjustments, and using the appropriate interventions, we can balance our hormones and enhance our emotional well-being. Thank you again for tuning into this deep dive on neurotransmitters and hormones and mood regulations. If you found this episode helpful, please subscribe and share. You can follow me on platforms like YouTube, Spotify, and Instagram and TikTok at Hillary Lynn MD for more health, longevity, and wellness insights. Our next episode will dive even deeper into inflammation and mitochondrial health and its effects on mood. So stay tuned for that and stay healthy.